She was tired. She was pregnant. She just wanted a little comfort. That was all Naomi had asked for. But when she requested a simple extra pillow, the flight attendant didn't just refuse, she humiliated her. Loud enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear, she dismissed her like she was nothing. What the flight attendant didn't know, Naomi's husband owned the entire airline, and by the time this flight landed, she was going to regret every single word. The flight that changed everything. Naomi shifted uncomfortably in her seat, adjusting the single pillow behind her back. She was 7 months along, and though she had been careful about flying, this trip was necessary. She ran a hand over her belly, feeling a soft kick from her baby, a reminder that she wasn't traveling alone. The first-class cabin hummed with quiet conversation. Passengers sipped on champagne and flipped through magazines, while the flight attendants moved gracefully through the aisles, offering warm towels and refilling drinks. Everything seemed peaceful, until a sharp pain shot through Naomi's back. She shifted, trying to ease the ache, but it didn't help. She knew exactly what would: an extra pillow. She waited patiently, watching as a flight attendant walked past. She lifted her hand slightly, offering a polite smile. "Excuse me, could I have another pillow?" The woman stopped abruptly, cold blue eyes locked onto hers. The name tag on her uniform read, M. Foster. She scanned Naomi like she was a problem to be dealt with, her lips pressing into a thin, unimpressed line. And then she sighed, loudly. Passengers turned their heads, looking up from their books and drinks. Naomi felt their eyes on her before Foster even spoke. "You already have one." The words were clipped, almost like a reprimand. Naomi blinked, caught off guard by the immediate attitude. "I know, but I'm pregnant and my back is hurting. If there's an extra one, I'd really appreciate it." Miss Foster's expression didn't soften. If anything, it hardened. She placed a hand on her hip, making no effort to lower her voice. "First-class amenities are limited, ma'am. We can't just give out extra pillows because someone asks." Naomi stiffened. The tone, the way she said it, as if Naomi was being needy, difficult, like she was asking for the impossible. A few passengers exchanged glances. Some quickly looked away when Naomi's eyes met theirs. She felt the flush creep up her neck, not because she was wrong, but because she could feel it. That awful, familiar feeling, like she wasn't supposed to be here, like she didn't belong. Her voice remained calm. "I wouldn't ask if I didn't need it." Mem Foster's expression turned irritated, as if Naomi was wasting her time. "Look, I understand you're pregnant, but rules are rules. If I give you another pillow, I have to give everyone another pillow. That's not how this works." The way she said pregnant, it wasn't sympathy, it was mocking. A way to say, "You're not special." Naomi's fingers curled around the armrest. She wasn't asking for special treatment. She wasn't even asking for much. Just a tiny, reasonable request. A second pillow. But the way this woman was speaking, she made it sound like Naomi was asking for a gold-plated throne. And what was worse, she had done it loud enough to make sure everyone heard. The moment no one spoke up before Naomi could say another word, a younger flight attendant hesitated before stepping forward. Lena, dark curls tucked neatly into a bun, eyes filled with quiet concern. She leaned in, voice gentle. "I think there might be some extra pillows in storage." Naomi felt a flicker of relief, but it lasted only a second. Mim Foster whipped around, eyes flashing. "And I think I know my job, Lena." The younger woman flinched slightly, then quickly stepped back. Passengers watched, but no one spoke up. Some of them had heard everything. Some had looked away, pretending they weren't listening. Others glanced at Naomi, then at Foster, as if deciding whether or not to get involved. No one did, and somehow that silence was worse than the words. It stung, a reminder of every other time she had been treated like she was out of place, like she wasn't supposed to be here, like she didn't belong. The moment everything starts to unravel, the power shift is coming. But first, let's deepen the injustice before we make the payback that much sweeter. The waiting game begins. Naomi's jaw tightened as the humiliation settled deeper into her chest. She had never been the type to cause a scene. She had never been the kind of woman who snapped at service workers, who made complaints over small inconveniences. But this wasn't small. This wasn't about a pillow. This was about the way she had been dismissed so publicly, so easily. She stared at her phone, waiting for a response, and then it came. "Julian, what's the flight number?" Her heart thudded. She knew exactly what that meant. She typed quickly, "Naomi, 3188, New York to Los Angeles." There was no immediate response, but she didn't need one. She knew her husband. Julian wasn't the kind of man who let things like this slide. He was calm, collected, dangerous in his silence, and if he was asking for the flight number, something was about to happen. Oblivious to the storm ahead, Naomi put her phone down, folding her hands over her belly, forcing herself to breathe deeply. She wasn't going to let Miss Foster ruin this flight. She wasn't going to let the humiliation win. But at the front of the cabin, Miss Foster moved as if nothing had happened. She poured herself a quick cup of coffee, muttering under her breath as she shot a glance toward first class. Lena, the younger flight attendant, was still visibly uncomfortable. She hesitated before speaking. "Miss Foster, I think she really needed that pillow." Her voice was careful, almost timid. She wasn't being unreasonable. Miss Foster scoffed, taking a slow sip. "Oh, please. You saw her. Some people just think they're more important than they are." Lena's stomach churned. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "She's in first class," Lena muttered. "She is important." Miss Foster rolled her eyes. "That doesn't mean anything. First class or not, we're here to follow policies, not to hand out extra pillows like charity." Lena's fingers tightened around her serving tray. She bit back her response. She had been working under Ms. Foster long enough to know one thing. Ms. Foster never admitted when she was wrong. The text that sealed her fate, back in her seat, Naomi's phone buzzed again. "Julian, stay put, I'll handle it." A small, knowing smile pulled at the corners of her lips. She didn't know exactly what he was going to do, but she knew Miss Foster was about to regret every word she had said. Naomi exhaled slowly, setting her phone down. Julian's message was short, but she knew him well enough to understand what it meant. This wasn't over. Not even close. The shift in the air, Miss Foster, oblivious to the storm brewing, continued moving through first class. She flashed forced smiles at passengers, refilled drinks, acting like nothing had happened. The tension in the cabin, however, was thick. It lingered. And for the first time, Naomi noticed something. People had been watching. Across the aisle, an older man in a suit cleared his throat. "Mr. Calloway," his voice was low. I saw what happened earlier." Naomi turned her head slightly, waiting. It wasn't right. The way she spoke to you? He adjusted his tie uncomfortably. "Just wanted to say that." Naomi studied him for a moment, noticing something important. He hadn't spoken up when it actually mattered. Now, when the damage was already done, he wanted to acknowledge it. She gave him a small, polite nod. "Thanks." He nodded quickly, looking relieved, and then looked away. What's coming next? Naomi didn't respond further. She didn't need to. Her eyes flickered back to Miss Foster, who still had no idea. No idea that right now, her entire future was being decided. Because as Naomi sat there, calm and composed, somewhere on the ground, Julian was already making calls. And Miss Foster? She was about to find out exactly how bad she had messed up. Julian's response is cold, calculated, and terrifying. Miss Foster has no idea she's already lost. Naomi's patience makes the payoff feel even more satisfying. The tension is palpable. Passengers feel guilty, but it's too late. And now, it's time for the reckoning. Because when Julian is done, Miss Foster won't just regret her words. She'll wish she had never stepped onto that plane. And turned back to his newspaper, pretending to read. Naomi wasn't interested in his delayed sense of justice. The people around her had all heard what happened. They had seen it, but not a single person had spoken up at the time. That was what lingered in her mind the most. Not just Miss Foster's rudeness, but the silence from everyone else. Then an announcement crackled over the intercom. "Miss Foster, please report to the cockpit immediately." The flight attendant froze mid-step, her cup of coffee still in her hand. Naomi's lips curled into a slight smile. "Here we go, passengers." Exchanged curious glances as Miss Foster straightened her uniform and made her way toward the front of the plane. She walked with confidence, her head held high, completely unaware that her fate had just shifted. Naomi leaned back in her seat, resting a hand on her belly. Whatever was happening in that cockpit, she already knew how this was going to end. M. Foster walked briskly toward the cockpit, her confidence unshaken. She had been a senior flight attendant for years, and she was used to handling passenger complaints. Whatever this was, she assumed it was nothing more than a routine inquiry. Maybe someone had requested special service, maybe there was a minor seating issue. But when she stepped inside the cockpit, she immediately sensed that this wasn't routine at all. The captain, Captain Reeves, was seated in his chair, his hands resting calmly on the controls. He didn't even look at her right away. Instead, his gaze was fixed on the small screen in front of him where a live video call was active. The man on the other side of the screen, Elias Grant, the airline's senior operations manager. Miss Foster's breath caught slightly. A call from corporate headquarters mid-flight. That wasn't normal. Captain Reeves finally turned his head toward her, his expression unreadable. "Miss Foster, do you want to explain something to me, Miss Foster?" Straightened her posture. "Of course, Captain, what's the issue?" Elias Grant leaned forward on the screen, his voice cool and controlled. "The issue, Miss Foster, is that we received a direct complaint from executive headquarters. A first-class passenger was mistreated on this flight. Would you care to elaborate?" Miss Foster stiffened. A complaint from executive headquarters? That meant someone very important had escalated this issue directly to the airline's top management. Still, she kept her expression neutral. "There must be some misunderstanding. I was simply enforcing first-class policies." Elias's voice sharpened. "Did you check her ticket before deciding she didn't qualify for an extra pillow?" Miss Foster swallowed. Captain Reeves sighed, already seeming unimpressed. "Answer the question, Miss Foster." Miss Foster hesitated for half a second before composing herself. "I checked it, yes. But I was ensuring fairness among all passengers. If I make an exception for one, others may expect the same treatment." Elias's lips pressed into a thin line. Then he dropped the bombshell. "The woman you refused to pillow is Naomi Williams." Ms. Foster's stomach plummeted. That name sounded dangerously familiar. Captain Reeves leaned back, watching Ms. Foster closely, as if waiting for the realization to fully sink in. Elias didn't wait. His voice was clipped and direct. "Do you have any idea who her husband is?" Silence stretched thick in the cockpit. M. Foster stared at them, her pulse beginning to race. "Her husband," Elias continued, "is Julian Williams the owner of this airline?" Everything stopped. Miss Foster felt her throat close up. The owner's wife, the pregnant woman she had humiliated in front of the entire first-class cabin, was married to the man who signed her paychecks. Captain Reeves adjusted his headset, sighing. "Mr. Williams has personally requested that you correct this misunderstanding immediately." Elias's voice dropped lower, more menacing. "When this flight lands, Miss Foster, you will be required to explain yourself directly to corporate. Do you understand?" Miss Foster's face drained of color. She had humiliated the wrong person. She barely managed to choke out a response. "Yes, I understand." Captain Reeves nodded toward the exit. "Then go fix your mistake." M. Foster turned on shaky legs and walked back toward first class. For the first time in her career, she was not the one in control. Foster's legs felt unsteady as she walked through the narrow aisle back toward the first class cabin. Her palms were damp, and for the first time in her career, she didn't know what to say. The conversation in the cockpit echoed in her mind over and over again. Naomi Williams, Julian Williams's wife, she had snapped at and humiliated the most powerful passenger on the plane. As she approached the first-class section, she could feel the eyes on her. Word had already spread. Passengers had seen her being called to the cockpit. And now they watched her return with an expression that no longer held the same cold authority. Naomi was still seated, her expression calm but unreadable. Foster swallowed hard, forcing a tight professional smile. As she crouched slightly to Naomi's level, for the first time in her life, she was beneath a passenger, Mrs. Williams, she said, keeping her voice low but loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear. There seems to have been a misunderstanding. I'd like to personally offer you another pillow. Naomi tilted her head slightly. She didn't respond immediately. She just watched Foster. Her gaze steady and firm. Foster felt her heartbeat pound against her ribs. I sincerely apologize for any inconvenience, she added quickly. Naomi folded her hands over her belly, letting the silence linger a few seconds longer. Then, finally, she spoke. "You're saying it was a misunderstanding?" she asked, her voice calm but laced with quiet authority. Ms. Foster nodded stiffly. "Yes." Naomi blinked once. "I had my ticket. I was in my assigned seat. I asked for something reasonable, and you refused publicly." A few passengers shifted in their seats, clearly listening, and Miss Foster's throat went dry. Naomi didn't let her finish. "You didn't ask anyone else in first class if they deserved to be here," she continued, her voice even yet sharper than before. "You didn't question if the man across from me was in his correct seat. You didn't check if the woman in 2C had a valid ticket. You just assumed I didn't belong." Foster's hands clenched slightly at her sides. She was used to controlling conversations, to enforcing rules, but now she was the one being held accountable. Passengers were no longer pretending not to listen. Some watched with thinly veiled curiosity, others with quiet disapproval. As Foster cleared her throat, "I may have made a mistake in judgment." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "A mistake?" she repeated. Miss Foster shifted uncomfortably. Naomi let the words settle. Then she sat up a little straighter and reached for her phone, tapping out a quick message. "Naomi, she's asking me to come back to first class now. What should I do?" A few moments later, her phone vibrated with a reply. "Julian, take your time. Make her understand what she did." Naomi slowly placed her phone down and looked back up at Miss Foster. "I'll go back," she said smoothly. "But I want to know why you thought I didn't belong here." Miss Foster's lips parted, but no sound came out. Passengers waited. She was used to giving orders. Now she was the one being questioned. Miss Foster stood, frozen, the weight of the moment pressing down on her like never before. The silence stretching between her and Naomi was suffocating. She could feel the stares, the quiet judgment from the first-class passengers who had all witnessed her actions. This was the moment where she had to explain herself. "But how could she? She started, but no words followed. Naomi didn't move, didn't blink. She just waited, her expression calm but unyielding. Miss Foster swallowed hard. I didn't think, but you did," Naomi cut in smoothly. Her voice wasn't raised, but there was something undeniable about the power in it. "You did think. You saw me sitting here, and you thought I wasn't supposed to be here." Miss Foster's skin pricked, under the weight of Naomi's words. You just made a decision about me before you even checked anything." Naomi interrupted again, her voice still steady and controlled. And when I told you I belonged here, you still didn't believe me. Why?" Miss Foster's mouth felt dry. The truth sat heavily on her tongue. She could feel it, could taste the bitter realization that Naomi was forcing her to acknowledge what she had refused to admit even to herself. She had judged. Her plain and simple. She had seen a young, pregnant black woman in first class and assumed she didn't belong. Naomi tilted her head slightly, her voice lowering, but somehow it carried even more weight. "If you're going to apologize, at least tell the truth." Miss Foster's stomach twisted. She wasn't used to being held accountable. She had spent years believing she knew best, that she could make decisions without question, but now she was standing in front of a passenger she had wronged, and there was no quick way out of this. Her lips parted slightly, and for a second she considered lying, saying she hadn't meant it that way, that it was about policy, not her personal judgment. But one look at Naomi's face told her that excuses wouldn't work here. Miss Foster's hands trembled slightly as she finally whispered, "I misjudged you." Naomi didn't respond. She let the words sit there, let Miss Foster feel the weight of them. A few rows down, a woman shifted in her seat uncomfortably across the aisle. A businessman glanced away, pretending not to listen even though he had heard every word. Naomi slowly stood, adjusting her posture as she prepared to move. She reached down, picking up her bag. Her movements deliberate and unhurried. Miss Foster stepped back to allow her through, but she still felt small, insignificant. Naomi walked past her without thanking her, without acknowledging her attempt at an apology, because Miss Foster's words didn't deserve a response. She reached her seat in first class and sat down, adjusting the pillow behind her back. The same pillow she had fought to keep. M. Foster remained standing there for a few seconds too long. Awkward, lost. She had always been in control, always been the one to command authority. Now she had never felt so powerless, and she had a sinking feeling that this was only the beginning of her downfall. Miss Foster turned stiffly and walked back toward the galley, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. The first-class cabin felt different now, as if the balance of power had shifted right before her eyes. She had spent years walking through these aisles with authority, expecting her words to be final, but now every step back to the galley felt heavier than the last. Passengers who had ignored the situation earlier were in glances at her now. Some looked disapproving, others simply curious. But no one was unaware anymore. They had seen everything. She stepped into the galley, gripping the edge of the counter to steady herself. Her breath was shallow, her chest tight. Lena, who had witnessed the entire exchange, stood nearby, quietly organizing drink trays. Miss Foster could feel her watching. After a long pause, Lena finally spoke. "That didn't go well, did it?" Miss Foster turned sharply, glaring at her. "I don't need your commentary," Lena shrugged, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something close to satisfaction. "I wasn't trying to comment," she said, her voice neutral. "Just pointing out the obvious." Miss Foster scoffed, picking up a napkin and pretending to wipe the counter, though her hands were still shaking. Lena hesitated, then lowered her voice. "She handled that better than you did." Foster froze mid-motion, the napkin still in her grip. Lena watched her reaction carefully, then sighed. "Look, I'm not saying I agree with how this went down, but you embarrassed her in front of a plane full of people, and now you're the one standing here like this." Miss Foster's jaw clenched. "I was doing my job." Lena tilted her head. "Were you?" Miss Foster's grip tightened around the neck napkin before she threw it down on the counter. She wanted to argue. She wanted to tell Lena to mind her own business, but she couldn't because, for the first time, she wasn't sure if she was right. Before she could say anything, the in-flight phone buzzed sharply from the wall panel. Miss Foster's stomach dropped. She already knew who it was. Lena took a step back, murmuring, "That's for you." Miss Foster swallowed hard and reached for the phone, lifting it with a trembling hand. She pressed it to her ear, forcing her voice to stay steady. "This is Miss Foster," a deep, calm voice spoke on the other end. "This is Julian." Williams, Miss Foster's breath caught in her throat. Her fingers tightened around the phone. This was not a conversation she wanted to have, and yet she had no choice. Miss Foster's pulse pounded in her ears. Julian Williams. She had never spoken to him directly, never even imagined she would have to. He was the kind of executive whose name carried weight, a man whose influence stretched across the airline industry like a shadow. And now his calm but dangerously measured voice was coming through the phone, addressing her. She cleared her throat, willing her voice to remain professional. "Mr. Williams, I don't need an introduction," Julian interrupted, tone smooth but undeniably firm. "I need an explanation." Miss Foster's throat went dry. "You're going to tell me?" Julian continued, slow and deliberate, "why my pregnant wife was made to feel like she didn't belong in first class." Miss Foster's mouth opened, but her brain scrambled for an answer. Every carefully rehearsed excuse she had used in the past sounded ridiculous now. Julian's voice remained level, but something in it carried weight. A warning: you had one job, Miss Fa, for one, to provide professional, unbiased service to every passenger, but instead you singled her out. I wasn't singling her out, Miss," Foster blurted quickly, grasping at straws. "I was just following company policy regarding amenities." A long silence followed, then Julian exhaled a sharp breath of controlled disappointment. "Tell me something, Miss Foster." His voice didn't rise, but somehow it felt heavier now, pressing down on her like a weight she couldn't shake. "Did you check the first-class seating manifest before questioning my wife's presence in that seat?" Miss Foster's fingers tightened around the phone. Yes or no?" Her stomach churned. She already knew the answer. "He wanted no," she whispered. Another long pause. "No," Julian repeated the word, laced with undeniable finality. "You did, because you didn't think you needed to." Miss Foster felt small. "You didn't ask the businessman sitting across from her for his ticket, Julian," continued, his tone razor sharp. "You didn't ask the older woman in 2C if she belonged in first class. You didn't stop to question anyone else. Just her." Miss Foster gritted her teeth. She knew he was right. Julian's voice dropped lower. "So? I'll ask again. What made you decide that my wife, my pregnant wife, didn't deserve the same treatment as the rest of the first-class cabin?" M. Foster felt her throat tighten. The answer hung in the air, unspoken but understood. She had seen Naomi and made an assumption, a bad one, a career-ending one. I made a mistake," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Julian let the words sit there for a moment before responding, his tone colder than before. "Yes, you did." M. Foster shut her eyes briefly, feeling the sinking realization that there was no recovering from this. Julian's next words confirmed it. "When this flight lands, you're going to be escorted off the aircraft for a full review," he stated plainly. "Your employment will be evaluated, and trust me, Miss Foster, I don't think you're going to like the outcome." Miss Foster's heart dropped into her stomach. This was it. Her entire career, 10 years of building in her position of enforcing rules, of controlling situations, was about to crash harder than a failed landing. Julian wasn't done, and one more thing he added: "From now until we land, you are going to give Naomi the exact same service that every other first-class passenger gets. And I mean every single privilege. If she so much as lifts a finger, you will be there to assist her. Do you understand me?" Miss Foster gritted her teeth, humiliation burning through her skin. "Yes, sir. Good." The line clicked. Dead. M. Foster slowly lowered the phone back onto its hook, her hands visibly shaking. The galley was silent except for the faint hum of the engines when she turned. Lena was still standing there, arms crossed, watching her with a look that was somewhere between pity and quiet satisfaction. "M?" Foster took a shaky breath, tried to compose herself. But she knew nothing would be the same after this flight landed, and she had no idea what was waiting for her on the other side. Miss Foster stood in the galley, gripping the edge of the counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her breathing was uneven, and the familiar Power she had always carried on flights felt like it had been ripped from her hands for the first time in her career. She wasn't the one enforcing authority, she was the one being ordered. Her head swam with Julian Williams' words. Escorted off the plane, employment under review. This wasn't just a minor reprimand, this was a disaster. Lena was still standing nearby watching her. She had seen enough to piece together what had just happened. Though she didn't ask for details, her expression remained neutral. But M. Foster could see the knowing glint in her eyes. She knew M. Foster had lost control of the situation. After a few moments, Lena spoke, her voice measured. "You should probably get out there, miss." Foster inhaled sharply, her fingers still clutching the counter. "I don't need advice from you right now, Lena." Lena shrugged, unfazed. "Suit yourself. But if I were you, I'd think about how I handle the rest of this flight, because whatever's waiting for you when we land," she tilted her head, "it's not going to be good." Ms. Foster knew that. She didn't need Lena to remind her. With shaky hands, she adjusted her uniform, took a deep breath, and forced herself to step back into the first-class cabin the moment she re-entered. She felt the weight of a dozen silent stairs passengers who had ignored the earlier confrontation were suddenly very aware of her now. Some quickly looked away, pretending to be absorbed in their in-flight entertainment. Others watched with thinly veiled curiosity, waiting to see how she would act now she sped Naomi. Calmly flipping through the in-flight magazine completely, at ease in her first-class seat as if the earlier encounter had never happened. But M. Foster knew better. Naomi wasn't ignoring her. She was making her wait, making her squirm, and it was working. Miss Foster swallowed her pride and walked up to her, her presence no longer commanding the same authority as before. She cleared her throat. "Mrs. Williams," she said, her voice unnaturally stiff. "Can I offer you something to drink, maybe a snack?" Naomi didn't look up. Immediately, she took her time turning another page in the magazine before finally glancing at M. Foster. "A drink," she repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Yes, Miss Foster," forced a polite smile. "Anything you'd like. We have fresh juice, sparkling water, tea." Naomi tilted her head slightly. "You didn't ask me that before." Miss Foster froze. Passengers nearby shifted, a few of them pretending not to listen, but they were. Naomi continued, her tone even. "When I first sat down, you didn't offer me anything. You didn't even greet me properly like you did with the others." She glanced around the cabin. "But now you're offering." Ms. Foster felt a sharp prick of shame in her chest. She had no way to defend herself. Naomi didn't raise her voice, didn't lash out, didn't demand anything. She was simply pointing out the truth. M. Foster forced herself to remain composed. I apologize if I wasn't as welcoming before. I assure you it wasn't intentional." Naomi studied her for a moment, then gave a small shrug. "I'll have a sparkling water." Miss Foster nodded quickly, relieved to have something to do, rather than just stand there under Naomi's scrutiny. She turned, hurried back to the galley, her hands gripping the tray a little too tightly. Lena was still there, arms crossed. She had obviously heard everything. Miss Foster avoided her gaze as she poured the glass of sparkling water. Lena finally spoke, voice light but edged with something amused that didn't go well, did it? Miss Foster clenched her jaw. "I don't need your comments." Lena smirked. "You keep saying that, but you also keep proving me right." M. Foster ignored her, grabbing the tray and heading back to first class. She carefully placed the glass on Naomi's tray table. "Here, you go, ma'am." Naomi picked up the glass, took a slow sip, then glanced at Ms. Foster again. "Oh, by the way," she said casually, as if she had just remembered something, "I texted my husband about you." Ms. Foster's stomach twisted. She forced herself to remain professional. "I see." Naomi set the glass down and leaned back in her seat, watching her. Yeah, he wasn't happy. M. Foster already knew that she had heard his voice on the phone not long ago, but hearing Naomi say it so calmly with that quiet confidence made her stomach turn even more. "I guess we'll see what happens when we land," Naomi added, picking up her water again, and, taking another slow sip, Miss Foster stiffened, nodding quickly before retreating back toward the galley. She had never wanted a flight to end so badly in her entire career, but she had a sinking feeling that her problems were only just beginning. Miss Foster walked back into the galley, her heart pounding in her chest, her palms clammy. The flight wasn't even over yet. She could already feel the walls closing in on her. The first-class cabin, a space where she had always carried herself, with authority and control, now felt like a stage where she had been exposed. Lena was still there, watching her closely. She didn't say anything right away, but the look on her face was enough. "You sure you don't need my comments?" Lena asked, raising an eyebrow. Miss Foster exhaled sharply, gripping the counter so tightly her nails dug into the surface. "Not now, Lena." Lena shrugged but didn't look away. "You know, you could have avoided all of this." Miss Foster snapped her head toward her, and how exactly was I supposed to do that? Lena folded her arms, tilting her head slightly, by not treating her like she didn't belong, by doing your job without making assumptions, by realizing that first-class passengers don't all look the same. Miss Foster felt the sting of those words. She wanted to argue, wanted to find a way to justify what she had done, but how could she? It was clear to everyone now she had seen Naomi Williams and made an assumption, and it had cost her everything. Lena sighed and he stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Listen, I'm not trying to rub this in, but if you think Julian Williams is the only one you need to worry about, you're wrong." Miss Foster's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" Lena glanced toward the front of the plane, then back at her people. "Talk passengers have been whispering about what happened, and I heard the captain on the radio just now." She paused. "Corporate is already preparing a statement. Foster felt her blood run cold. Her pulse quickened as she processed what that meant. This wasn't just about her facing a review. This wasn't something that would stay. Within the company, this was bigger. If corporate was preparing a statement that meant one thing, this incident had already started spreading. She swallowed, suddenly feeling suffocated in the galley. Lena watched the panic set in inside. "If I were you, I'd start thinking about what you're going to say when we land." Miss Foster didn't respond. She couldn't, because at this point she wasn't sure if anything she said would even matter. Back in first class, Naomi leaned back in her seat, scrolling through her phone she wasn't checking. Messages she was watching, the way passengers kept stealing glances at her. They had all been silent when Miss Foster humiliated her, but now that they knew who she was, they suddenly seemed more interested across the aisle. The older businessman, Mr. Calloway, cleared his throat again. I hope everything has been sorted out," he murmured, his tone hesitant. Naomi looked at him for a moment, then gave a small, polite nod. "It has." She didn't bother saying anything else. She wasn't interested in making anyone feel comfortable about their silence. Her phone buzzed again. "Julian, we land in 30 minutes. Sit tight." Naomi smiled slightly. Oh, she would, because she had a feeling that Foster's bad day was only going to get worse. The seatbelt sign dinged on as the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened. Tables are in their upright positions." Naomi buckled her seatbelt, stealing a glance toward the front of the plane. Miss Foster was avoiding first class. Now she hadn't come back after delivering the drink. Naomi knew exactly why she was stalling, avoiding the inevitable. Because once they landed, she wouldn't be walking off this plane the way she usually did. Her phone buzzed again. "Julian, security is waiting at the gate. Stay seated when the doors open." Naomi's smile grew. Foster had spent the entire flight believing she had power, but now she was about to find out what it felt like to have none. Miss Foster stood in the galley, her breathing shallow, the descent of the plane mirroring the sinking feeling in her stomach. The realization had fully set in. There was no escaping what was coming. Every second brought her closer to landing, closer to whatever awaited her beyond that jet bridge. She gripped the counter, staring at her reflection in the small stainless steel panel above the beverage station. She looked shaken. That wasn't like her. She had always been so composed, so in control. But now the very foundation she had built her career on felt like sand slipping through her fingers. She had spent years walking through flights with an air of confidence, believing she knew best. She enforced rules. She maintained order. But today had exposed something uglier. She hadn't enforced a rule. She hadn't maintained fairness. She had humiliated a woman who didn't deserve it. A woman who, as it turned out, had the power to end her entire career. Her fingers trembled as she smoothed out her uniform, trying to steady herself. She had to compose herself. Maybe there was still a way to fix this, to explain it away, to find some angle that would make this less catastrophic. But before she could even convince herself, a sharp buzz from the in-flight phone shattered her thoughts. She stared at it. The final call before landing. She already knew who it was. Slowly, she reached for it, her fingers cold as she lifted it to her ear. "This is Ms. Foster." The voice on the other end was not the captain's. It was a security officer waiting at the gate. "Ms. Foster?" The voice was professional but clipped. "Per orders from executive management, you will be required to disembark the aircraft last. Do not attempt to leave the plane until you are escorted. Do you understand?" Miss Foster's stomach dropped. "Disembark last. Escorted." She gripped the phone tighter. I don't understand. This is not a request." The officer interrupted, his voice firm. "A meeting has been scheduled with airline executives upon arrival. You will be escorted directly from the plane. Do you acknowledge?" Miss Foster felt the blood rush from her face. A meeting, direct escort. This wasn't just a simple reprimand. This was a corporate level. Her response, she had lost control of this situation the moment she dismissed Naomi Williams, and now everyone on this plane was about to see the consequences. She forced herself to swallow, her throat dry as sandpaper. I understand," and the call ended with a sharp click. Miss Foster stood there, her hand still clutching the phone, her breathing uneven. She felt Lena's eyes on her again. "You look pale," Lena muttered, watching her closely. Miss Foster turned slowly, trying to mask the panic clawing at her insides. "I'm fine," Lena's lips twitched. "Yes," but she said nothing. She just nodded as if she already knew how this was going to end. The plane's wheels touched down with a smooth glide, the gentle impact rocking the passengers in their seats. The first-class cabin remained eerily quiet, yet the energy had changed. There was a tension, a feeling that something was about to happen. Naomi adjusted her seatbelt, her fingers absent-mindedly smoothing over the curve of her belly. She felt calm, but she was fully aware of the shift in the air. People knew not just about what had happened earlier, but about who she was. Passengers who had remained silent before were now hyper-aware of her. Some glanced in her direction, others avoided eye contact altogether. No one had spoken up for her earlier, but now that they knew she was connected to power, now that they had seen Miss Foster's sudden shift in behavior, they were uncomfortable. Naomi wasn't surprised she had seen this before, how people only cared about injustice when it affected the wrong person. She glanced down at her phone. "Julian. Security is at the gate. Stay seated." She smiled slightly. She had no intention of moving as the plane rolled to a stop. The seatbelt sign dinged off. And instantly, the usual shuffle of movement began, passengers unbuckling, gathering their bags, stretching after the long flight. But something was off. No one in first class rushed to leave instead. They lingered. They were waiting to see what would happen next. Naomi stayed seated, completely at ease, while Miss Foster remained out of sight in the galley. Then, just as the jet bridge attached and the front doors unlocked, with a soft hiss, a uniformed security officer stepped onto the plane. This time, everyone saw the officer moved with purpose, his gaze scanning the cabin before landing on Naomi first. He nodded politely. "Mrs. Williams, welcome to Los Angeles. If need anything, let us know." Naomi returned the nod, her voice even. "I'm comfortable, thank you." The security officer turned his attention to the galley. "M. Foster," he called out. Every single passenger in first class froze, heads turned. Whispers started, eyes widened as Miss Foster emerged from Golly, her face was ashen, her steps hesitant as she realized what was happening. This wasn't just a private matter anymore. She was being publicly removed. The security officer didn't touch her, but his presence alone was enough. "You need to come with us." The entire first-class section was silent. Some passengers pretended not to watch. Others openly stared, but no one was indifferent anymore. Miss Foster's breath hitched. She straightened her uniform out of instinct, trying to hold on to whatever dignity she had left. "This is unnecessary," she whispered harshly. The officer didn't react. "Executive management has requested to speak with you directly. You'll be escorted off the aircraft." M. Foster's jaw clenched. She turned desperate to find one friendly face, but found none. The power she had carried on this flight was gone, and Naomi simply watched, expression unreadable. She didn't gloat, she didn't smirk. She just let M. Foster feel the weight of her own actions. M. Foster inhaled sharply, and with trembling hands picked up her bag. Her walk down the aisle felt endless each step, like a public acknowledgement of her downfall. She had humiliated Naomi Williams at the start of this flight, and now she was walking that same path. But this time, it was her humiliation on display. As she stepped off the plane and into the jet bridge, the doors behind her sealed shut. The finality of it settled deep in her bones. Naomi finally leaned back in her seat, reaching for her phone. "Julian? She's off the plane." She exhaled, typing back, "Naomi, good." Because now, for the first time this entire flight, she could finally relax the doors sealed shut behind Miss Foster. But the weight of her removal lingered in the air. First-class passengers usually quick to gather their things, and leave sat in uneasy silence. It was as if they were processing what they had just witnessed, as if the entire atmosphere had shifted beneath them. Naomi remained seated, unbothered, her fingers lightly tapping against her phone as she exchanged messages with Julian. The power dynamics of this flight had reversed in a way no one had expected, and now the tension hung thick. Like a storm that had passed, but left behind a lingering chill across the aisle, Mr. Calloway, the older businessman, adjusted his tie. He hesitated, then finally leaned forward. Slight L, I just wanted to say that was... Naomi turned her head toward him, waiting. He cleared his throat. That was quite something. She tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. What was he? Hesitated again. What happened with the flight attendant? Naomi didn't blink. You mean when she humiliated me in front of everyone, or when she was escorted off the plane? The man swallowed, clearly uncomfortable. Well, you meant the part where she faced consequences. Naomi finished for him, her voice calm but razor sharp. Calloway looked away, suddenly fascinated by his watch. He knew she was right. He had been sitting there the whole time like everyone else, watching but saying nothing. Naomi sighed, shaking her head. You all sat here and watched her talk down to me, and no one said a word, but now that you know who I am, suddenly you care. Calloway's face rent, and he quickly busied himself with gathering his things. Naomi wasn't looking for an apology from him or anyone, because the truth was, this wasn't just about her. How many times had something like this happened to someone without power, to someone who couldn't send a text and have justice delivered by the time the plane landed? She wasn't special. She was just one of the few who had the means to make sure people saw it happen. As if to confirm her thoughts, a woman a few rows ahead, dressed in an expensive navy blue suit, turned slightly in her seat. She had been silent the entire flight, but now she gave Naomi a small nod. I should have said something, she murmured. Naomi studied her for a second, then simply replied, yes, you should have. The woman nodded again, then turned back around, staring at the window as if lost in thought. Naomi wasn't looking for validation, she wasn't looking for regret from strangers, but she knew that today something had shifted in them, because next time maybe someone would actually speak up. As the passengers in first class slowly began gathering their things, the door to the jet bridge reopened, but this time it wasn't M. Foster returning, it was Julian. He stepped onto the plane like he owned it, because he did. His sharp black suit was crisp, his polished shoes barely making a sound against the carpeted floor. He was tall, commanding, and had the kind of presence that didn't require him to raise his voice to be heard. Passengers who had previously ignored Naomi were now wide-eyed, sitting up straighter, as if just realizing who they had shared a cabin with. Julian didn't look at them. His eyes were focused on one person only, Naomi. A slow, knowing smile tugged at the corners of her lips as she watched her husband walk toward her. Julian reached her seat and extended a hand. "Come on, sweetheart, let's get you home." She placed her hand in his, allowing him to help her up, his grip strong, steady, and reassuring. "You didn't have to come all the way to the plane," she murmured, amused. Julian chuckled. "I don't like loose ends." His voice was smooth, but there was a sharpness beneath it, a reminder that this wasn't just about a flight attendant's mistake. This was about making sure it never happened again. Julian turned slightly, scanning the first-class cabin. His gaze was unreadable, but his presence alone made the remaining passengers shift awkwardly in their seats. They knew what had happened, and now they knew that the woman they had ignored was married to the man who could end careers with a single decision, without another word. Julian placed a gentle hand on the small of Naomi's back and led her toward the exit as they stepped into the jet bridge. The whispers behind them were almost deafening, but neither of them looked back because this was over for them. For M. Foster, it was just beginning. Outside the plane, near the gate, 2 airline executives were already waiting. Julian barely acknowledged them as he led Naomi forward, but they nodded respectfully at him before turning their full attention to Miss Foster, who stood, pale-faced and stiff, awaiting her fate. She was no longer in control, no longer the authority in charge of the cabin now. She was just an employee under review. Julian finally stopped near the private exit where their car was waiting. Naomi exhaled as she glanced over at her husband. "So what happens to her?" Julian shrugged, his jaw tightening slightly. "She's suspended until the board reviews the incident. But let's be honest, she won't be coming back." Naomi nodded, a quiet acceptance settling in her chest. "Good." Julian glanced at her. "I know you're not just thinking about her." She sighed, rubbing her belly gently. "No, I'm not." She was thinking about all the people who had been in her place and didn't have a Julian Williams to make things right. Julian was silent for a moment, then pulled out his phone, tapping something quickly. "What are you doing?" Naomi asked, curious. His lips curled slightly, fixing it before she could ask what he meant. He was already speaking into the phone. "Yes, this is Julian. I want a new policy implemented immediately. Mandatory bias training for all first-class crew members, increased oversight on passenger treatment, and I want a new complaint system set up. One that doesn't require someone to be married to the CEO to actually get hurt." Naomi's chest warmed. Julian Williams didn't just handle problems, he changed the system so they wouldn't happen again. She smiled, wrapping her arm around his. "You really don't like loose ends, do you?" He smirked. "Not when they mess with my wife." The car door opened, and as they slid inside, Naomi leaned back against the soft leather seat, exhaling for what felt like the first time since takeoff. Miss Foster was gone, the flight was over, and somewhere in the sky, a new policy was being written that would make sure that the next Naomi Williams wouldn't need a powerful husband to be treated with respect. Now that was justice. The car pulled away from the terminal, smoothly merging onto the road as the airport disappeared behind them. Naomi rested her head against the seat, feeling the weight of everything settle. The tension she had carried since that moment in the air was fading, replaced by something calmer, firmer, the knowledge that justice had been sad. Julian sat beside her, one arm stretched casually along the back of the seat, his phone still in his other hand. His sharp eyes skimmed the emails and notifications pouring in, his fingers moving efficiently as he handled business with the same quiet dominance he always carried. But Naomi could feel it. He was still angry, not just about what had happened to her, but why it had happened at all. She turned her head slightly, watching him for a moment. "What are you thinking?" Julian didn't look up right away. He finished typing something, then locked his phone and set it down beside him when he finally met her gaze. His expression was unreadable. "I'm thinking about how many times that flight attendant has done that before," he said, evenly. Naomi's fingers tightened slightly over her belly. Julian continued, his voice lower. "How many times she's treated someone like that and never faced consequences?" Naomi exhaled. "Probably more than we'd like to know." Julian leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "She only changed her attitude when she realized who you were. That's what bothers me the most. If you had been anyone else, someone without connections, without power, she wouldn't have thought twice about humiliating you." Naomi nodded slowly. "I thought the same thing." Julian shook his head, his jaw tightening. "People like her think they can get away with it because most of the time, they do. She probably thought she could talk to you like that because she's done it before and no one's ever checked her." Naomi sighed, rubbing slow circles over her belly. "Well, she's been checked now." Julian's gaze flickered toward her stomach. His expression softened slightly, but the tension still lingered in his body. "She had, as he agreed, but it's not enough." Naomi gave him a small, knowing smile. "That's why you're doing more than just firing her, isn't it?" Julian smirked slightly. "You know me too well she did, Julian. Williams wasn't the kind of man who simply punished one person and moved on. He changed things." Naomi sat up a little straighter. "What else are you planning?" Julian's smirk faded as his expression turned serious. "I'm making sure this doesn't happen again. Not just to you, but to anyone." He picked up his phone again, scrolling through an email. Before holding it out, her to see, Naomi's brows lifted as she scanned the screen. "New corporate directive, immediate investigation into passenger treatment in first-class cabins." Her lips parted slightly as she read the internal memo outlining an entire audit of the airline's customer service standards. "This is happening across all routes?" she asked. Julian nodded. "Every flight, every crew, every attendant. I want to know if this was an isolated incident or part of a bigger problem." Naomi glanced at him, impressed. "And if it is a bigger problem?" Julian's expression darkened. "Then we fix it." There was no hesitation in his voice, no room for doubt. Naomi reached over and squeezed his hand. "That's why you're the best at what you do." Julian chuckled, lifting her hand to his lips and pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles. "I don't know about the best, but I do know one thing." "What?" He smirked again. "I love watching you make arrogant people squirm." Naomi laughed, shaking her head. "I didn't even do anything." "Oh, you did," Julian said. "You held your ground, you made her admit her mistake, and the way. You made her squirm before accepting that drink. That was art." Naomi grinned, leaning back in her seat. "She deserved worse." Julian's expression turned slightly darker. "She did," Naomi sighed. "But the truth is, I don't want to waste another second thinking about her. She's not important. She's not worth our time." Julian studied her for a moment before nodding. "All right," she smiled, squeezing his hand again. "I just want to go home, put my feet up and eat something fried and unhealthy." Julian chuckled. "Done." He tapped on the screen of the car's intercom. "System, take us home and stop by that seafood place Naomi likes." Naomi sighed in contentment, already picturing the crispy shrimp and fries waiting for her. This day had started with humiliation, but it was ending exactly how it should, with her at peace and Miss Foster out of a job. And honestly, that was the kind of happy ending she could get used to. The car glided smoothly through the city streets, the hum of the engine a low, steady presence in the background. Outside Los Angeles bustled with life. People walking, neon signs flashing, the evening air thick with energy, but inside the car there was only calm. Naomi rested her head against the seat, her fingers absently rubbing small circles over her belly. The baby had been active the entire flight, but now finally she felt the little kicks, slowing. Maybe the baby could feel it too, the shift from tension to peace. Julian glanced over at her, his sharp eyes softening as he watched her relax. "Long day," he murmured. Naomi chuckled lightly, tilting her head toward him. "That's one way to put it." Julian reached for her hand. Threading his fingers through hers, his touch was warm, grounding. "I hate that this even happened," he said, his voice quieter now. "I hate that you had to sit there and deal with that." Naomi squeezed his hand, her thumb running over his knuckles. "I've dealt with worse." Julian's jaw ticked, his eyes darkening for a second. "You shouldn't have to," Naomi sighed, turning her gaze to the window. "But I do. We do." Julian stayed silent because he knew this wasn't just about a flight attendant with a superiority complex. This was about a system that made people like MF feel untouchable. A system that let people dismiss women like Naomi, look through them, question their place in spaces they belonged. Julian didn't believe in just fixing individual problems. He believed in tearing down the whole system and rebuilding it better. That's why Naomi had fallen in love with him in the first place. She turned back to him, watching the way his thumb absently tapped against the leather seat, his mind clearly still turning. "You can't fix everything, you know." Julian smirked slightly, tilting his head toward her. "Watch me," Naomi chuckled, shaking her head. "You are so dramatic." His smirk grew. "And you love it," she sighed, but she couldn't argue because he was right. Julian leaned in slightly, his voice dropping lower. "I don't like people thinking they can treat you any kind of way. I don't like the fact that if it were anyone else in your seat today, she would have gotten away with it." Naomi's smile faded slightly. "She probably has before." Julian's jaw clenched. "Not anymore." Naomi tilted her head, watching him. "Are you planning something else?" Julian leaned back, stretching his arm across the back of the seat. "Let's just say M. Foster won't be the only one under review. I want every flight attendant reevaluated. If this is part of a pattern, I'll find out, and if it is," he exhaled slowly like a man who already knew the answer, "then there's going to be a lot of new job openings at my airline." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "Firing a bunch of people isn't going to fix everything." Julian smirked, but making them scared to pull that kind of thing again. "That'll do for now." Naomi laughed lightly. "You really don't like loose ends." Julian leaned in, pressing a kiss to the back of her hand. "Not when they involve you." Naomi sighed, relaxing into the warmth of his touch. "All right, Mr. CEO, you win," Julian smirked. "I always do." The car slowed as they approached their first stop, a small, upscale seafood restaurant, the kind where the food was greasy but the ambiance was fancy enough to make people feel like they weren't eating fried calories. Julian's driver pulled up to the curb, and within seconds a waiter was already stepping outside. Holding a carefully packed to-go order ready and waiting, Naomi blinked. "Did you?" Julian winked. "Had them start cooking the moment we landed." She grinned. "This is why I married you." Julian chuckled, taking the bag from the waiter and handing it over to her. "I thought you married me for my charm." Naomi opened the container, inhaling the warm, buttery scent of perfectly seasoned shrimp, and, freeze, she sighed in pure joy. "Nope," she said, popping a fry into her mouth. "Definitely for this." Julian shook his head, laughing, but his eyes were soft as. He watched her. The car pulled away again, heading toward home. For the first time that day, Naomi felt completely at peace. The humiliation from earlier gone, the frustration handled, and Miss Foster, she was just a memory now. Because when Naomi woke up tomorrow, she'd wake up to her life as usual. But Miss Foster, she'd wake up to hers falling apart. And honestly, Naomi had zero sympathy. The city lights blurred past the windows as the car moved through the streets, the soft hum of traffic outside blending with the quiet inside. Naomi sat comfortably, one leg tucked beneath her, picking at the crispy shrimp in the takeout container. The rich flavors danced on her tongue, and for the first time all day she felt fully at ease. Julian watched her, a knowing smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "You look like you just won something." Naomi raised an eyebrow, popping another fry into her mouth. "I did. I got my pillow, I got my justice, and now I have fried food. That's the Holy Trinity." Julian chuckled, shaking his head. "You're impossible," she grinned, licking a bit of sauce off her thumb. "And yet you married me." His smirk widened. "Best decision I ever made." She rolled her eyes, but there was warmth in them. The exhaustion from the flight, the weight of everything that had happened was finally lifting. There was no more Miss Foster to deal with. No more silent passengers pretending not to see what was happening. The battle had been fought, and won. The only thing left now going home. As the car turned onto their street, Naomi glanced at her phone. A few unread messages sat in her notifications, but one in particular caught her attention. A forwarded email from Julian's executive assistant. She frowned slightly and clicked it open. As her eyes scanned the subject line, a slow, satisfied smirk spread across her face. Subject: termination notice. Marla Foster. Naomi let out a small hum of amusement, tilting her phone slightly so Julian could see. "Guess it's official," she mused. Julian barely spared the email a glance, leaning back in his seat. It was official the moment she got escorted off that plane. Naomi chuckled, shaking her head. "You don't play fair, do you, Julian?" Stretched lazily, exuding that same effortless confidence that made him so dangerous in the boardroom. "I play to win." She gave him a look, and what exactly did you win? Julian reached over, taking the last fry from her container. He popped it into his mouth, chewing slowly before giving her a smug look. "You," Naomi groaned, smacking his arm. "You're so corny." Julian just laughed, clearly pleased with himself. The car slowed to a stop in front of their home, the large modern estate bathed in soft lighting. Naomi sighed in relief, stretching her arms as she reached for the door handle, but before she could step out, Julian's hand caught her wrist gently. She turned to him, eyebrows raised. What his expression had shifted. Still, soft, but now tinged with something more serious. "I just want you to know," he said quietly, "that if this ever happens again, if anyone ever tries to make you feel small like that." Naomi smiled, placing her free hand over his. "Julian," he exhaled, his grip tightening just slightly. "I mean it. I don't care if it's a flight attendant, a board member, a CEO, or the president of the damn country. No one gets to treat you like that." Naomi felt that it wasn't just words with him. It was a promise that he would always protect her, stand by her, fight for her when she needed it. She squeezed his hand, her voice soft but full of certainty. "I know." Julian studied her for another moment before finally nodding. He let go of her wrist and stepped out of the car, walking around to open her door before she could even move. She chuckled. "I can open my own door, you know." He smirked. "I know, but I like doing it." She rolled her eyes but stepped out, breathing in the cool night air. The stress of the flight, of Im Foster, of the entire exhausting situation, it all melted away. Home, that was the only thing that mattered now. Julian led her up the steps, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back as they entered the house. The familiar scent of lavender and warm vanilla greeted them. Their home was sleek, modern, but never cold. It was a space that felt lived in, comfortable, full of life. Naomi kicked off her shoes, sighing in pure relief as she sank onto the couch. Julian loosened his tie, watching her with amusement. "You look like you just melted into the furniture." "I did," she murmured, stretching. "This couch loves me and I love it." Julian chuckled, disappearing into the kitchen for a moment before returning with a bottle of water. He handed it to her, then sat beside her, his arm draped lazily over the back of the couch. For a few moments, they just sat in silence. No drama, no tension, just peace. Finally, Naomi let out a deep breath. "Today was wild, Julian." Smirked. "Yeah, and you still made it look easy." She glanced at him, amusement flickering in her gaze. "Oh, I made it look easy." Julian nodded, his expression serious. "You handled that flight attendant better than most people in a boardroom." Naomi laughed softly. "I wasn't trying to, I just didn't want to let her win." Julian's smirk faded slightly, his gaze turning more thoughtful. "You didn't just win, and you made sure she won't do that to anyone else." Naomi's lips parted slightly at that. She hadn't thought about it that way. She had been so focused on getting through the situation, on not letting it get to her, that she hadn't realized her standing up for herself had changed something not just for her, for anyone else who might have been in her position. Julian reached for her hand again, lacing their fingers together. "You know," he mused, "maybe I should just make you head of the customer service department." Naomi snorted, shaking her head. "I'd fire half the staff in a week." Julian laughed, and "I'd support every single termination," she sighed, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Let's not talk about flights for at least a week." Julian kissed the top of her head deal. She closed her eyes, letting the exhaustion settle. She was home, safe, loved, and Miss Foster, M. Foster, was somewhere trying to piece her career back together. Justice had been served. And Naomi, she was finally free to rest. Some people think they can treat others however they want, until they face the consequences. What do you think was justice served? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video, share your thoughts, and subscribe for more stories like this.